Until now, we have seen how to calculate the elasticity of supply. When we calculate the elasticity of supply, we get a number which we call as elasticity of supply. But now let's understand what does that number mean? How to interpret that numerical value? Let's see. When we calculate the elasticity of supply, we generally get a number which is between 0 and infinity. So when the number is 0, the numerical value is 0, we say that the supply is perfectly inelastic. That means the supply or the quantity supplied is not changing. It is not elastic, but it is constant. A change in price does not bring about any change in supply. The quantity supplied remains constant. So we call it perfectly inelastic supply when the numerical value is 0. Now let's understand how does perfectly inelastic supply curve look on a graph. Now this is a graph where on x-axis we have taken quantity and on y-axis there is price. Now let's say the price is P and the quantity supplied at this price is Q. Now I am increasing the price to P1. Yet I see that there is no change in the quantity supplied. I even take it to P2. Yet the quantity supplied does not change. In this case, we see that we get a straight line curve which is parallel to y-axis. This supply curve is a straight line and it is parallel to y-axis. So it's a vertical curve, a vertical supply curve parallel to y-axis. So when the elasticity is 0, we call it a perfectly inelastic supply curve, and a perfectly inelastic supply curve is always parallel to y-axis. Also remember that a perfectly inelastic demand curve is also parallel to y-axis. So in either case, the case of a perfectly inelastic demand and in case of inelastic supply, perfectly inelastic supply, the curves for both of them are parallel to y-axis. Now let's see if we get the answer of elasticity of supply which ranges between 0 and 1. Let's say the answer is 0.5 or it is 0.67 or it may be 0.8. When the answer ranges between 0 and 1, we call it relatively inelastic supply because the range is between 0 and 1, or we can say that elasticity is more than 0 but less than 1. In this case, we call it a relatively inelastic curve. That means a bigger change in price brings a smaller change in quantity supplied. You can see in the graph given below. Here Originally, at price P1, quantity Q1 is being demanded. And when the price rises to P2, quantity Q2 is being demanded. We see that the change in price is bigger than the change in quantity. So a bigger change in price brings a smaller change in quantity. And when this is the case, we say that the supply is relatively inelastic. It is not perfectly inelastic. In case of perfectly inelastic, the supply will not change. Here the supply is changing but not in proportion to a change in price. So we say that the supply is inelastic, alright, but it is relatively inelastic, not perfectly inelastic. And how do you think will be the supply curve? The supply curve would be tilted towards the y-axis. It will be steeper. So the supply curve in this case is generally steeper and tilted towards y-axis. Let's assume that when you calculate the elasticity of supply, you get the answer 1. It is exactly 1. If the elasticity of supply equals to 1, we call it unitary elasticity of supply. Unitary elasticity of supply implies a proportionate change in supply in relation to price. That means an equal amount of change in both supply and price. The supply changes by as much as the change in price. So what happens is the change in price is equal to the change in quantity supplied. This leads to a curve which is a bisector curve. We call this curve a bisector curve. This is a bisector curve. This bisects the origin into two equal angles of 45 degrees and 45 degrees. So it bisects the origin into two equal angles of 45 and 45. So we call this curve as a bisector curve. Now let's assume that the answer that you get from the elasticity of supply ranges between 1 and infinity. It is between 1 and infinity, or elasticity of supply is more than 1 but less than infinity. If this is the case, we call it relatively elastic. Let's say the answer is 5 or 2 or 20. This is a case of relatively elastic supply. And in this case, the supply curve is tilted towards the x-axis. It is a flatter curve. It is a flatter curve tilted towards the x-axis. In this case, a smaller change in price brings about a bigger change in quantity supplied. The quantity supplied changes in a higher proportion than the change in price. Finally, the case of perfectly elastic supply curve. A perfectly elastic supply curve is a curve where the supply or the quantity supplied changes even if there is no change in the price. Let's say the original price is P and the original quantity supplied is Q1. Now the price remains the same, yet the quantity supplied increases to Q2. Again, the price remains the same, the quantity supplied increases to Q3. So what happens is, in this case, we get a straight line supply curve. But this straight line supply curve is parallel to x-axis. A straight line supply curve which is parallel to x-axis is called a perfectly elastic supply curve, because the supply is perfectly elastic here. It changes even if the price has not changed. That means no change in price brings about an infinite change in supply. That means price is the price is not the factor that is determining supply here, but supply is being changed because of some other factors, some other reasons. Also, a perfectly elastic demand curve is also parallel to x-axis. So a perfectly elastic supply curve or a perfectly elastic demand curve, both are parallel to x-axis.